From political leaders to ordinary citizens, South Africa is mourning the loss of Nelson Mandela while celebrating his life. Earlier, I spoke with Ebrahim Rasool, the South African ambassador to the United States. He was part of the anti-apartheid struggle since he was in high school. In the 1980s, he was jailed for his activism, and that's where he met Nelson Mandela.
I entered high school in 1976, which was a very difficult year. It was the year of the Soweto student uprisings. And that's when I tasted my first tear gas and saw my first rubber bullet from the apartheid police. And that was the year in which we began to hear the name Nelson Mandela again, because from the time of his jailing, the nation had been quelled into silence by a brutal apartheid regime, and so we whispered his name. By 1980, we got a little bit more brave, and we began to say his name. I think I saw by 1983, when I was part of the leadership of the United Democratic Front, we were defiant about Nelson Mandela. We were shouting for his release, and we were insistent that he must be free as the symbol of our own freedom. And then in the 1987 state of emergency, I was arrested and detained in Pollsmoor prison, where Nelson Mandela was also now at this time. And a warden contrived for me to meet Nelson Mandela in the hospital. I had never seen him before. I had never heard his voice before, but I knew that this was Nelson Mandela. And I wouldn't exchange that moment for 10 years of freedom if it were to present itself to me again. That's the aura with which we carried Nelson Mandela around. He embodied our goodness, he embodied our sacrifice, and he embodied our values. It is very important throughout history that every great leader, before he conquered the external enemies, have had to wrestle with himself or with herself. Every great leader conquers his or her own soul first before they can conquer the external enemy. And that's what prison does to you. It confronts you only with yourself. You don't have anyone to blame. You can rail against the system, but in the darkest moments when you are quiet and alone, locked up in your cell, in a small confined space, you only have to confront yourself. Nelson Mandela went in one person and came out another person out of that experience. And the truly brave and wonderful people are those who are able to have that conversation with themselves. No wonder Nelson Mandela's second book or third book is Conversations with Myself, because it's in that conversation that you A, get to know yourself, and B, get the opportunity to change yourself. In a very real sense, Mandela's greatest power was to be in the shoes of the other, whether the other is the friend or whether the other is the enemy. He could imagine, because of his keen sense of dignity, he could imagine how he would indignify F.W. de Klerk if he acted in a particular way. That he always understood that the way to get a leader like F.W. de Klerk to give of his best was to invest strength and dignity in F.W. de Klerk so that he can face his people with his dignity intact and persuade them that the road ahead is a manageable road. That's the power that I would want to ascribe to Nelson Mandela.